Good evening. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with David Frank. This is Redwood Wonk on Access Humboldt. You are listening to us on the radio or on television or on the internet. And we've got so much news today. We've had to really pick and choose as to what we can fit into our less than an hour. But we want to start with the biggest news. The biggest news being that the Voters' Rights Act, which finally generated some consensus with the Democrats, was introduced to be presented for debate. And of course, it got filibustered by 50 Republicans unanimously not agreeing to let it go to debate. And so the Voting Rights Act, which was, had a number of measures, I think they were talking about paring it down. Manchin had worked out a deal with the with Schumer, where he would be allowed to present his alternative bill first, if by some miracle it had passed, and as an amendment. And of course, he was open to some reforms, not to others. He was open to having a national election holiday, open to some filibuster reform, but not open to publicly financed elections, and not open to having quote unquote no excuse absentee ballots. It would have been quite a compromise, but it didn't go anywhere. Manchin and Sinema and the other moderate Democrats all did agree to vote for it, or to vote for bringing it to debate. And of course, it can't even be brought to debate. You've got the right to filibuster at the front end and the back end. You can actually prevent debate, and it is one of the reforms that some people have been talking about. The filibuster is the possibility that you can filibuster at the end, but that it's not an option to prevent debate, because the whole point of you filibustering it is because somebody is way out of order in terms of being in touch with the American people. So why not allow a debate so that we can determine that? But it's just something that makes it real easy to debate. But Manchin has hinted that he's open to not eliminating the filibuster altogether, but he is open to reform, possibly forcing you to speak in sort of the Jimmy Stewart way that we've discussed on the show before, and possibly reducing the number to 55. It's a difficult one. The Voting Rights Act cannot be passed by reconciliation. It's not a budget-related item, so it. Excuse me. At any rate, that's where we're at. There was a lot of progress made, and what the Democrats wanted was to make sure they had a unifying front. They did not want it in the narrative that there was dissension within the Democrats about sending that bill forward. And in fact, Schumer made some kind of deal with Manchin, perhaps an indication that Manchin may move on either the filibuster on reform of the filibuster, because he put out his alternative bill and Republicans shot it right down, said it's no better. So his call for bipartisanship is looking pretty useless at this point. We could talk a little bit more about that. But Dave, what's your take on the story?
I think there's like two key issues to keep in mind, and so they frame this issue a little bit better before looking at sort of the minutia of the bill. So the one part of this is, like you said, that bipartisan approach to a compromise solution for improving electoral standards. That was shot down by Mitch McConnell, kind of defeating or deflating any hope so far. With respect to that, so we're talking about Senate Republicans, but the leader of the Senate Republicans, McConnell, said there's nothing wrong with the way this last election was conducted, and there's no reason to have a federal intervention in what should be a state level administration of elections. So that's kind of a principle that he laid out there. But he also, another principle of his from just a couple months ago was 100% of our focus, meaning the GOP in the Senate, is on stopping this new administration. So he's got an overall strategy of blocking everything. And then within that, he's saying there's nothing to see here.
Right.
There's no reason for us to actually even think about changing the election standards or laws. But the reality is that standards have been necessary in the past. And a new set of federal voter access protection standards still allows for state level administration. So that's kind of the like, let's look at what we're looking at. But then, so secondarily, how could that be true, but also be the case that you've got 14 Republican-led states, whether it's the governor or legislature, currently passing or in the process of passing a few dozen bills that do things like voter roll purges, partisan poll observers, door-to-door citizen investigators. I'm not sure. This is one that not a lot of people have heard about, but in Arizona, there was a leaked document from the Department of Justice, a letter to the head of the Arizona Senate saying that the behavior that you are endorsing of sending people door to door to follow up on voter rolls to determine if there's suspicious activity in voting patterns and registration patterns, that's potentially a violation of the Voting Rights Act guidelines. So that's actually happening, where the Justice Department is already intervening in some of these partisan activities. So we could touch on this in a little bit, but the question, therefore, this like, where do we go from here, is what can be done both to protect rights proper, for example, Justice Department investigations, but beyond that, can a larger bill get passed without navigating around the filibuster, as you mentioned? So I'll pick up on that last piece after I hear your feedback.
Well, sure. I mean, obviously, and one of the things McConnell did say is it's a bill looking for a problem that doesn't exist, right? And of course, the biggest people complaining about the last election, whether it's suitcases full with ballots or bamboo paper ballots coming from China or anything like that, is coming from the Republican side. It's not so much the complaints about the last; it's the complaints about the laws that are being passed in states around the country, which will effectively restrict voting, will reduce the number of votes, requiring photo ID, to the silly things we've discussed, like not being allowed to bring pizza to people waiting in line if they're too close to the ballot center, and but mostly making it harder to vote absentee and making it more difficult to vote by mail, shutting down the drop boxes, limiting drop boxes, maybe even eliminating them altogether in some places. And so, these are things that are calculated to reduce the numbers of voters of certain categories of people, because they know it's particularly effective against in limiting people of color who vote, sometimes older people who vote, and sometimes younger people who vote. If the more of a hassle it is, the more you got going on in your life that makes it difficult, that you haven't really, aren't able to do it. It's easy for people to say, oh, well, it's easy to get a photo ID. It's even free. But it's not that easy for everybody to do that, and not everybody thinks in terms of getting an ID so that they can vote. If they don't drive, they don't need an ID, right? So anyway, it basically will reduce, and then of course, to address the massive purges of voters, people have showed up to find out they were no longer registered because they shared a name with somebody who had been convicted of a felony. And so, a lot of that going on. This is what it's aimed at. And of course, McConnell's going to block it because they want fewer people voting. That's absolutely certain. They've actually said it outright in some of their statements that there's just too many people voting. Look at all these people who voted. We don't need that many people voting. It's like, so it may actually be a backlash against them, because actually some of the Trump constituencies are also in the groups that tend to not know what to do about absentee ballots, or tend to be outside of the system and haven't voted and not know what they need to do up until the election. But maybe maybe that's part of it too. Maybe the mainstream of the Republican Party would like to get rid of some of them to deal with their own primary hassles. Who knows? I don't know, but definitely it's become a partisan issue. There are no Republicans proposing any compromises. They don't want any voter reform, period. And that is what their message was. And the Democrats wanted a unified 50, all 50 of them voting so that they could use this as a wedge issue in the upcoming election. And also because there's are rumors in Washington, D.C. that Biden is going to be sitting down with Manchin and the other moderate Democrats and saying, you're stymieing us. You need to ease up, and maybe offering something for it. But there is going to be pressure, and there's indications that Manchin is getting fed up with the Republicans because every time he tries to come up with anything bipartisan, he gets burned, like he got burned on this one. So it may be that he will be more willing to look at least some type of filibuster reform, which maybe doesn't shut down the filibuster entirely, but in context of certain discussions such as voter rights, which is supported by something like 70 to 80% of the people, might make a filibuster politically untenable.
I do think it's important at this point to kind of flesh out a little bit the filibuster and the circumvention of the filibuster, just because we see now that this filibuster is, in a sense, it's in need of reform. It's currently been, reformed already for the reconciliation process, like we talked about, and for judicial appointments, like we've talked about. But in fact, it's not a coherent philosophical principle. There's absolutely no reason why we don't add civil voting rights protection to the list of principles where we're going to waive the filibuster. In fact, the 14th and 15th Amendments, the post-Civil War amendments that actually granted so much of the rights and liberties to Black people in America and to a whole slew of civil rights. The penumbra of rights that come out from under that, according to, that's how the Supreme Court interprets the importance of these amendments. That was done under one-party rule. Granted, it was, at the barrel of a gun at the end of a civil war. But the truth is that Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution says that the federal government must maintain control of federal elections. So there is, in theory, a constitutional justification for it, especially in light of the fact that right now, the overarching story, and I have to give credit to Michelle Goldberg of the New York Times. I heard her say this on a show recently. The overarching story of American politics right now is that the Republicans are laying the groundwork to accomplish legally what they failed to do by force on January 6th. So you and I, we talked about possibly covering the January 6th commission, that the Pelosi's intended to announce this week. I say we put that off until it's actually, been called. But we realize that that's happening in a different way right now, in a sense. The Republican legislatures in several states are systematically changing these rules to make it harder for constituencies to vote. Well, the filibuster has this romantic appeal to it. But in fact, it was, the history goes that it was really just an oversight, that the rules weren't in place effectively. So they put it in place 1806 to cut off debate. And that's when it was set up. 2/3 of the senators was adopted in 1917. So It took a long time for it to modify. And then it was evolved to 3/5 in 1975. So that would be a natural evolution if we lowered the threshold to cut off debate like that, to force a vote. But so this last thing that I want is important to mention. The filibuster was a favorite tool of pro-slavery senators before the Civil War, segregationists afterwards. And throughout the 20th century, it was used to derail civil rights bills, from anti-lynching measures to bans on housing discrimination. So, and it ramped up during the Obama administration. There was a study by the Congressional Research Service that said that about 50% of all of the judges that were shot down or not voted on because of the filibuster was done since 2009. So much of this has evolved to a present, our present state of affairs. We have this romanticized vision of it, and we need to reflect on it.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, William Jefferson Clinton, do solemnly swear.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear. So help me God.
Okay, we are, of course, moving into the beginnings of the 2022 campaign. The strategies of both parties, Democrats wanting to hold on to Congress, Republicans wanting to take it, are starting to form. And it looks like, the big things that the Republicans want to use are the immigration, the border, which we'll get into later in the show, but also they seem to believe and are willing to bet that they can make hay out of the critical race theory, the issue as they're making it into an issue, as they did defund the police, which effectively did help them win a number of races. Defund the police is, it forced the advocates to say, well, it doesn't really mean we're taking all the money away from the police. Well, that's what the word means. So next time, be more careful about the rhetoric. But critical race theory, it seems to be the big issue. I think a lot of right wingers, a lot of Republicans are making hay of it. There's like 5 states which are passing bans on critical race theory. I've actually read a couple of those laws that have been passed, and they don't really define it well. I think most people who don't like critical race theory don't know what it is. It's kind of like, that old commercial, people who don't like Czech cereal have never tried Czech cereal. Critical race theory, first of all, isn't a doctrine. It's an approach of inquiry. And they just don't get that, but they seem to think that they've got the American people, particularly, the white suburban middle-class people, all up in arms about critical race theory. One of the things that the Texas law says is the curriculum cannot make white children feel as if they are responsible for slavery and other, things that happened in the past. Well, nobody teaches that. That's dumb. How could they be responsible for it? Nobody can go back in time, So it's but that is actually in the law, in the Texas law, and I think it's in the laws that are being passed around. So they feel confident that they can use this as a wedge issue to draw suburban white voters away from the Democrats in 2022. Before we take your comment, Dave, I want to say that may have been blunted today because there was a hearing in which I think the Republicans pushed their hand too far. They asked a couple of the generals, it was General Austin and General Mark Milley. Well, they just asked, Matt Gaetz just asked General Austin about, what's happening with the militaries and becoming too woke. And General Austin said, well, we don't teach critical race theory and we don't intend to, blah, blah, blah. I think that's specious. And General Mark Milley had a different perspective, and he wanted to break in and respond. And what he said has got to be one of the most eloquent 2-minute speeches I've seen in a long time. And without further ado, we'll go to that.
Sure. First of all, on the issue of critical race theory, et cetera, I'll obviously have to get much smarter on whatever the theory is. But I do think it's important, actually, for those of us in uniform to be open-minded and be widely read. And the United States Military Academy is a university. And it is important that we train and we understand. And I want to understand white rage, and I'm white, and I want to understand it. So what is it that caused thousands of people to assault this building and try to overturn the Constitution of the United States of America? What caused that? I want to find that out. I want to maintain an open mind here, and I do want to analyze it. It's important that we understand that because our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians, they come from the American people. So it is important that the leaders now and in the future do understand it. I've read Mao Zedong. I've read Karl Marx. I've read Lenin. That doesn't make me a communist. So what is wrong with understanding, having some situational understanding about the country for which we are here to defend? And I personally find it offensive that we are accusing the United States military, our general officers, our commissioned, non-commissioned officers, of being, quote, woke or something else because we're studying some theories that are out there. That was started at Harvard Law School years ago, and it proposed that there were laws in the United States, antebellum laws prior to the Civil War, that led to a power differential with African Americans that were 3/4 of a human being when this country was formed. And then we had a Civil War and Emancipation Proclamation to change it. And we brought it up to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. It took another 100 years to change that. So look, I do want to know. And I respect your service, and you and I are both Green Berets. But I want to know. And it matters to our military and the discipline and cohesion of this military. And I thank you for the opportunity to make a comment on that.
Thank you, General.
Watching somebody like this wearing a uniform, being a general, talking this way. But I want to know is the slogan. I want to know. I mean, that's a great thing. It's about having humility and wanting to know and wanting to learn more about things, wanting to learn more about the country, wanting to learn more about how different people think. And and I think the problem that the Republicans are going to have is the term critical race theory by itself just isn't all that evil sounding, right? Defund the police, you can attack it on the basis that, there's a misunderstanding. Critical race theory, what's wrong with being critical? What's wrong with having a theory? And what's wrong with addressing issues of race? David.
So before I go to the big picture, I think it's appropriate to comment on General Milley's testimony, pushing back on a claim that reading a book would undermine loyalty and commitment to the United States. I think his quote was something like, "It's offensive to accuse officers who study theories to better understand issues about race that affect the lives of America's soldiers and citizens." I'm paraphrasing, but it is offensive on the face of it to condemn somebody for trying to understand things better. And he points out the maybe inconvenient truths to some folks in Congress that our laws in our country designated Black people as 3/5 of a person before the Civil War. And then we fought a civil war over that legal structure. And then it took 100 years for the Civil Rights Act to formally codify those principles that the founding fathers, mid-19th century statesmen, just tried to implement into law. So it's on the face of it, there has been a legal evolution to incorporate America's founding and aspirational principles. So then the question is, to pivot away from the general, critical race theory itself, it's a way of looking at the enduring patterns of inequality, how law contributes to the status of minorities and immigrants in our country, and it's a curriculum for law school students. I took a philosophy of law class many moons ago, and the critical race theory book that we read at the time, it was eye-opening to me as a 19-year-old, 20-year-old person, because I wasn't exposed to those concepts before. So if it's the case that people are being exposed in law school to a way to look at the law, that's what critical race theory is. There's an evolution of ways of teaching these lessons to younger people and people who have not been exposed to these ideas. But there's no curriculum in the K through 12 schools at all. So to a certain extent, it's a boogeyman that's being posted out there to scare people. There's a backlash, effort to reverse the racial reckoning. This quote I heard in a conversation recently, backlash to reverse the racial reckoning, unlike we've seen in our lifetime. So, we can't say we're for racism. People can't say that anymore in good conscience. You can't say that you're for Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd. But you can say, oh my goodness, if we look at it through the prism, if we look at law and rules through the prism of race, that somehow that's racism. It doesn't pass the stink test that anti-racism is framed as racism.
Well, and just to bear in mind, critical race theory, technically speaking, is not even anti-racism. It's a framework of inquiry. It's looking at things in a certain way. When people say, well, what are the tenets of critical race theory? There are no tenets. It's not an ideology. It's not a doctrine. It's a way of studying history, of looking at it in a different way. And there may be conclusions that have been drawn by some professors of critical race theory that are wrong. That could be true. That can happen, and those are up to debate. It's the point that is saying that this is, some people, some historians are looking at history this way and how it relates to the structure of our society. And why should you be afraid to talk about it? And why are you afraid that your children's minds are incapable of, making up their own minds about what it is? And, it's just like, well, it tells white kids that they're, responsible for their history. It doesn't. Nobody says that. I mean, it's insane that they even create that. But Steve Bannon thinks that this is the winning ticket for them to do it. He says this is going to be the Tea Party to the nth degree. He thinks he can whip up a lot of anger and pushback against quote unquote critical race theory. And like I said, first thing the question should be asked in any of the Democratic versus Republican debates that comes up is, what do you mean by critical race theory? I mean, they'll have a hard time answering that because they don't know. And if they have to start answering it, they're going to start talking about like it's doctrine. If the Democrat is prepared, they can take them apart. I'm not so sure this is a winning strategy for them.
I'm with you. Yeah. So that's good that you pivoted to the strategy portion of it, and you referenced GOP strategists in particular, because the mouthpiece of that network of strategists, the Fox News channel, air quotes on the news, they had 1,300 mentions of critical race theory in the past 3.5 months. So rough math, 10 times a day. So every hour of the day during the daytime, they're mentioning it. And it's really an attempt for team building to drum up, GOP activists to go protest in public. And it's working. People are actually going to school boards and acting up. And, not just that. You've got Senator Cruz, Senator Rubio, Vice President Pence. They attended a recent conference or multiple conferences. I've seen the video footage in a montage of venom, but basically saying that it's Marxist, it's racist, it's bigoted. So they're trying to label it. And it's worth mentioning that there is a Republican strategist, a conservative strategist, Christopher Rufo. He's a documentary filmmaker and researcher at Discovery Institute and at Manhattan Institute. And so he's pretty popular right now because there was what he's called a hit piece against him in the Washington Post. But really, it's basically he comes out and says, we are framing the public conversation about this to drive up the negative perception. And, it's literally a strategy that he said out loud. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. So it's their strategy, and they're sticking to it in spite of the reality.
Critical race theory is Marxist because one of the several BLM founders identified herself as a Marxist. So therefore, critical race theory is a Marxist. That's really how basic it is. It's it's not Marxism. It's different from Marxism. It addresses a whole different aspect. But it's kind of like that Spanish character in Princess Bride. You keep using that word. I do not think you know what it means. I mean, it's just that's got to be used. But yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous. And thank you, General Milley, for framing it. That will probably be the viral response, and that may blunt some of it. We'll see. Anything you want to add, Dave?
I'll ask one last thought here. Is that so people are hearing, parents, families are hearing, or even in the workplace, adults. What we're hearing is that, they're out there. There are equity programs teaching about racism, teaching about inclusivity, and that people, may have concerns about that. So rather than address those concerns, they're vilifying the whole broad stroke idea of reflection here.
All right. Well, that takes us to a next topic where I think the Republicans may have a more effective attack.
Today, we celebrate the triumph not of a candidate, but of a cause. The cause of democracy.
We are going to raise issues that, historically have not been raised.
What about the nuclear option, doing away with the filibuster? I can tell you that would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised.
All of this is possible for America. Who was standing in the way? Mitch McConnell.
Where an insurrection that sought to overturn an election, when that failed, the action moved into state capitals.
Okay, that brings us to, there's been quite a bit of news today about immigration, the border in particular. For one thing, the head of the Border Patrol, Mr. Scott, forgetting his first name, is no longer going to be heading up the Border Patrol. Rodney Scott is the name. And on top of it, in response partly to criticism a couple of weeks ago when Vice President Kamala Harris went to Central America, made a few flippant remarks that had got her into a little bit of political trouble, and said there's no reason to go to the border just to do photo ops and the rest, is actually going to take a trip to the border. We're not quite sure what the itinerary is, what the goals are, but what has been suggested by former President Trump is that she is going down there to try to preempt the trip that he and Bill O'Reilly are going to the border to highlight the chaos and crisis at the border ever since Joe Biden came to office. And of course, record numbers of people coming, particularly from Honduras and El Salvador, but to lesser degree from Nicaragua and Guatemala, are seeking asylum. And unfortunately, Vice President Harris said, don't come to the border. And that a lot of immigrants' rights activists took umbrage with that, saying they have a right to come and apply for asylum. They have a right to do that. Don't tell them not to do that. But, because of the crisis in Central America, the numbers have been pretty large, and they are coming here, and the system is overwhelmed. It actually began before Joe Biden. It's actually the increase in the migrants arriving at the border began last April as we were in the pandemic crisis. But it has really taken off, and of course, the minute they're not in power, Republicans are saying, "Well, you need to fix that, Joe," so. There is a big discussion about it. This is going to obviously be in the news cycle for some time to come, with Harris going to the border, followed up by Trump and Bill O'Reilly. There'll be a lot of media discussion about it.
So I would say that, I think it's the White House who had a off the record kind of explanation of what the sequence of events, that it's cause and effect, so that Vice President Harris went down to Guatemala first, because to acknowledge that the cause is, the like you said, the Northern Triangle crisis in those countries in that region. And that the effect is the impact on our border over time. And so we have these cyclical peaks and valleys of immigration stresses on our border, that, some years it's worse and just, some years it's a little better. But the reality of it is that there was a comprehensive immigration reform passed many moons ago that had, to a certain extent, bipartisan support. Senator McCain is who I have in mind as the person who kind of was the front person from the GOP, Republicans. That just seems like ancient history right now. We can't pass anything almost anything in a bipartisan way. Juneteenth got passed, but very, very few things are getting passed. And so the idea that the Democratic Party leadership has no concept of how to handle this crisis is not really accurate. It's just that it's very hard to get things through. So there's limited tweaks that can happen at the White House administrative level. barring some more comprehensive reform. And, we could get into what comprehensive reform might look like, but this is more of a political one-upsmanship, to a certain extent, the vilification of the other party, as opposed to more robust and coherent discussion of the policy issues of what it would take to reform the border crisis.
Yeah, I mean, what I think Biden's administration should be doing right now, first of all, is highlighting the success stories, the people who have come here and looking for asylum, been granted asylum, and who several months ago were languishing in Central America, and now their kids are making snow angels up in Minnesota. Not at this moment, but a few months ago. They need to humanize it with those stories. That's what should be out there. Is they need to be talking about that. They have moved most of the kids out of Border Patrol custody into DHHS custody, and that makes it a little bit easier to do things. The resources are better, and a lot of them are being placed with relatives that they can be found in the States, sometimes being reunited with families and the rest, and they need to really play up those successes as to the human side of this. Say, yes, a lot of people are coming. Why are they coming? Because they need to come. I think if they don't get aggressive with that, instead, having the headline say, no, don't come, you don't have a right to come. I think they just need to embrace it. They did it during the campaign. They need to say, we need to provide the resources to be able to account for them. We have low birth rates in this country with almost every other group. People are concerned writing these. I'm not that concerned about it, but people are writing articles in the New York Times about what are we going to do about the low birth rates and the negative impact it's going to have on the economy as people are getting older and the rest. Well, we have a lot of room in this country, believe it or not, and immigration is possibly a solution to that. So let families come in who want to work, give them, and it needs to be integrated into a program. The problem is you're only president for 4 years. It's hard to do that, but that needs to be what they're out there saying, not don't come, but or I'd rather be in Europe. But to address it, they were right to address the root causes. They need to be aggressive on why people are coming and what we can do for them.
Yeah, and part of this, the why they're coming. I think we covered this in a prior conversation, but it's a combination of factors that it's not all economic. So much of it is safety and security at home. When you've got criminal enterprises that are in effect destabilizing communities, and you've got governmental, pro-business governmental leadership that is not really responsive to the demands of the folks who are being impacted by that. Not to dismiss these countries out of hand, but this is one significant element of it. Another element of it is the fact that that the farming industry in the United States, the meatpacking industry in the United States, office cleaners, there's a long list of industries that heavily employ immigrant labor. And so and I remember at one point they were saying if we didn't have temporary immigrant labor here in the farming sector, that we would a significant portion of our crops would be rotting on the ground because those aren't jobs that Americans would take. And so
where some people have turned against it is that their children are going to college and offering competition in white collar or light blue collar industries. It was sort of like if they would stay on the farm, we wouldn't mind so much. But now you're taking our jobs, blah, blah, blah. And of course, yeah, they are. They're going to school. They're and learning. But that's what every parent's dream for their children. They'll work hard so their kids can go to school and live those lives. It's the American dream. What's the problem? But well, that's the rhetorical question.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm with you on this. And then, like I said, it takes a serious reflection. There are lots of folks out there that study this their whole lives have lots of great ideas, but our media climate, our political climate, we're not actually debating immigration policy. What we're doing is the optics of who gets to show up in front of the cameras at the border earlier on the calendar, how much of a scene can they make, and how can they drum up their base or reinforce their support amongst their base. It's the electioneering strategies that are really the predominant conversation here. And so this, in the context of, this election cycle in 2022, the Republicans are very interested in flipping the House and the Senate. And so a border grandstand is consistent with the last 4 years during the Trump administration, and even during the run up to his election, how they prioritized that that approach to building the support of their base.
Okay, well, that takes us to our last topic. All right. This is, of course, a show about national politics, but sometimes local politics has enough national significance that we need to discuss them. And on yesterday, the state of New York held its elections. One big piece of news before we get to New York City is that I'm forgetting her name, but she was elected as mayor of Buffalo, the first socialist, self-identified socialist to be elected mayor of a major city in 60 years. The last one was Frank Zeidler, who was elected socialist as a mayor, socialist at the heights of McCarthyism of Milwaukee, of all places, Wisconsin, where McCarthy was from. But I don't know if that was some type of Milwaukee defiance. I don't know. But anyways, big news, for those on the left, it was a big win. Centrist, who's part of a machine, appears to have been defeated. There's really no Republican challenge in the fall, so it looks like there will be a socialist mayor of Buffalo. But the biggest news for national is New York City held its mayoral election. The New York City mayor is probably about the most important position in the country, most significant, other than presidents, senators, and congressmen and governors. When Giuliani was mayor and he presided over the response to 9/11, he was known as the mayor of the United States. The luster is kind of gone, as we know, due to recent events, but there were a number of candidates vying for this spot, including Mr. Yang, who was the presidential candidate, was ahead in the polls, then kind of slipped. And I think he came in fourth. He will not be the next mayor. But New York City operates by ranked choice voting. And the person who has received the most first round ballots, with 32% of the vote, was Eric Adams, former police officer who considers himself to be a reformer, but probably made a lot of ground on his approach to law and order, on crime, which is a little bit tougher than some of the other people. There's a rise of violent crime across the country since the pandemic started, which is counterintuitive, but it's been happening. It may blunt some of the initiatives for criminal justice reform. And this might be an indication, but it's not over yet because he has 32% of the vote. And as we know from ranked choice voting, until somebody has more than 50% of the vote, each time they eliminate the bottom and then count those, the bottom one, and count those people's second votes. And there's no guarantee that Adams was number one with everybody's second votes. So there is still a lot. I believe the closest person to him was 10 points behind. So anything can happen with that. But this is the first time a major decision is going to be done by ranked choice. We've had some jurisdictions of ranked choice voting, but it really hasn't come down to that because usually incumbents get more than 50%. But the mayor was termed out, so we had a slew of new candidates, and we are going to see, it's going to be an education, ranked choice voting in action.
Yeah, so this is a fascinating study in political election reform. It's a considered democratization because it allows people to vote strategically. They still get to vote for their first preference without feeling like they threw away their vote in a head-to-head two-candidate race. So I think that big picture, it's amazing. In a city the size of New York, which I think I heard last night has a population that's greater than about 40 out of the 50 states. I don't know if that's actually true, but I heard that last night.
I believe it.
Yeah.
It's huge.
So it's a case study for us all. And it's pretty fascinating too that Andrew Yang, who apparently had so much national exposure, showed up in this race, and it was an early frontrunner, as you alluded to. But in fact, there was some policy elements that he just wasn't familiar with. He was not, he's not a mayoral candidate necessarily. He just doesn't know a lot about the administration of a city. So while he might be popular, he didn't work his way up through the ranks. And so, there was talk of coalition voting where he then identified one of the candidates and said, hey, if you're not going to vote for me, vote for her, vote for me first, vote for her second. So as you said, this jockeying will take place, and it's a new development for us all, and how elections are going to play out. One thing that I do think is interesting about the leader, Adams, he was captain, like you said, in the police department, but he's also well known for being one of those people that's a straight shooter, somewhat unorthodox, and kind of says things that are controversial without much remorse. And I think that style of leadership has its own appeal to a certain portion of the population, that he's going to roll up his sleeves, get things done. He's not going to take things from people. And so, for why that's important to us here in our community, in part, I think ranked choice voting stands, but also, stands as something that's worth following in and of itself. But also the idea that right now, post-COVID, post-Trump, looking for that style of leadership on the horizon, who might be appealing to people, even in a predominantly Democratic place, predominantly liberal, progressive, or at least moderate to liberal city like New York. There's still an appeal to somebody who's unconventional, controversial, shoots from the hip, and with the perception that he's going to get things done because of his stand-up style.
Yeah, he also is addressing the rising crime, and that may actually be an issue that Democrats have to contend with over the next year, because there is a rise in violent crime. Apparently pandemic related. Again, I thought if everybody's staying home, why is that happening? I don't know if it's domestic violence or what. But anyways, it's it is there. But we are getting to see it in action, because they passed it in a lot of places, including Eureka. But so far we haven't really had an opportunity where everybody had under 50% of the vote to actually see how it works. So this will be an education for the whole country, and they will either like it or not like it, or maybe a combination of both. But it's fascinating. I mean, it allows you to vote for who you want, and and pragmatic at the same time. Because splitting the vote doesn't really matter. If somebody has over 50%, it doesn't matter how the rest are split up. That person is going to win. So anyway, it's going to be very interesting. The politics were very contentious. I think Eric Adams doesn't like the ranked choice, of course, because we won't know probably until next week. For one thing, absentee ballots are still have to be counted, and for another, it takes a little bit of time to administrate this. To figure out, okay, who is ahead with the second ranked votes. Of course, all of your first choice voters stay the same, but only those whose primary candidate was eliminated, it goes to their second ranked votes. I'll be very curious to see how many people just voted for one candidate too. That'll be an interesting test of whether or not people like the idea of having ranked choice or just didn't understand it. And
Yeah, so on that note, one final thought here from me is that the New York Times, it's worth looking into if you're remotely interested in the strategy, getting it explained to you of ranked choice voting. New York Times, there was an editorial in there that was basically like telling all the New Yorkers, okay, look, guys, like this is actually more democratic, and here's how you could express yourself best using this new system. And it went through different scenarios, like if you want to do this, and it showed you how to order your priorities in terms of first choice, second choice through, I think, 5 choices. And it kind of plays it out if you're at all policy wonk like us and you kind of want to geek out on how these strategies work. It was really insightful, and I suspect that that's going to be something worth learning more about from no matter what your political perspective is, because it's probably we're not going to get a parliamentary system anytime soon, but if we are going to have more than 2 parties ever, this is how it probably will start to materialize.
And it'll start at the local level, but it will be. We will be watching it. We will report back on it on a later show. All right, that takes us to predictions. Dave, what have you got for us today?
I wish it wasn't so dire, but I'm talking today about the Delta variant of COVID, as it we see countries around the world locking their borders from travel and canceling public events for months just to wait and see how things play out. You've got countries like the UK where the COVID Delta variant is doubling its proportion of cases every 2 weeks. Well, it turns out that in the United States right now, the 14-day change in COVID cases in Missouri and Oklahoma are over 50%, Arkansas just under 50%, Utah plus 25%. So we've got this experiment that we talked about just a week or so ago. Yes. What's going to happen in the states where vaccination levels are low or just resistance to the science is high. Misinformation and disinformation run supreme. That we're starting to see it. So I heard Dr. Fauci say it, the simple reality of it is that, transmission leads to replication, leads to mutation. And so this is the current variant, the current mutation that is really troubling. And so, unfortunately, I predict that we're going to see this second wave in the fall in some of these Republican-led states, and it's going to be uncomfortable.
Especially since it's actually affecting younger people more than the other variants, and that's going to have a different kind of impact if that expands. Yeah. All right, my prediction. I want to go back to the immigration. As you know, the Border Patrol, head of the Border Patrol, was let loose, has been reassigned. Harris is going to the border. I'm looking at it in some other stories. I think that Biden will be releasing, will be introducing an initiative of some sort. It's hard to know what it is, but all the makings are there. I don't think they're sending Harris there just to steal thunder from Trump. I don't think they're sending him there just in response to the critiques that came out a couple of weeks ago. I think they're sending her there for a specific purpose, to announce some type of initiative that may involve executive orders, since they can't count on anything from Congress at the moment. And I think it's intended, whether or not it's one of great substance, to basically change the narrative on that. And I'm wondering if it's going to include what I suggested, humanization of the story. We'll find out. All right. Well, that's the end of the show. I want to thank Matt for engineering and doing a great job behind the scenes. You can, of course, listen to us on KCZH on Tuesday and Thursday nights at 7 o'clock. You can also watch us on Access Humboldt 12 at 7:30 on Wednesday nights and 7:30 on Saturday nights. And you can also see us at any time, beginning probably tomorrow night sometime on actually always tomorrow night, the latest one on the internet at YouTube for Access Humboldt. So if you ever want to reach us, you know where to reach us there. Till next time, keep thinking.